We live in a time when, as he has pointed out, things are moving so rapidly and into such complexity that the old ways don't work anymore. So we need to be able to think, learn, unlearn the past, and learn about the future in a totally different way. And one of the institutions, one of the kinds of institutions that are essential for this are think tanks. Now, if you walk down Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., one street, in fact, on one block of one street, you will see literally dozens, if not hundreds, of think tanks worrying about many of these issues. They are science-based issues. Of course, in India, we have many, many think tanks, but the kind of think tanks that worry about these issues that we're talking about here, which are really eschatological issues. These are existential issues. These are life-threatening issues in terms of both global as well as local survival. Many of them are in this room. If you compare with these dozens and hundreds of institutions in one little avenue in Washington, D.C., we may have half a dozen of them in India, in the whole country. You got institutions like CEW, TERI, Development Alternatives, Balipara Foundation, ATRI. You can count them more or less on the fingers of two hands. But once you're done, you have no one to provide independent, home-based, indigenous solutions to the problems that we are identifying. So this whole issue of Make in India and going through that to where we have to go, it is crucial that we nurture the kind of thinking that's going on here. I have to tell you, my fear is that under the present, what in India we call dispensation, under the present regime, it is difficult to think independently. It is becoming quite hard for think tanks to strike out on their own, because anything that is inconvenient to the establishment is inviting pretty difficult times for the thinker. So the Club of Rome is not the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome India thinks about both global issues and local issues in a way that we can only do so with an Indian lens, with an Indian perspective. So I'd like to take you very, very quickly through what I see as the difference between a debate that would be going on the same subject, let us say in New York or in Geneva, and what it should be doing in Bombay or Delhi, or in the boondocks in the remote areas of our countryside. Well, there are lots of us who live very well, and there are lots of us who live very differently. I'd like to show this picture because it's a picture from the center part of India, where a lot of my organization's work is taking place. And you know, this woman in there, with all her children, everything she owns is in that picture. You might say her whole world is in that picture. And what is worse is that when you look at those little girls, and you wonder, one of them could have been a Lata Mangeshkar, she could have been a Marie Curie, she could have been a scientist, a doctor. None of them is going to have a chance. So when we come to talk about efficiency, we've got to also talk about the implications of that efficiency in both the richer parts of our country, the more affluent parts of the country, and the poorer parts of our country. So the first thing is we have a consumption society, India, and a subsistence society, Bharat, living cheek by jowl in the same place, in the same time, and they have extremely different viewpoints. If you see the two pictures on the right, that is a family called the Patkars in Ujjain, whose food for 1 week has been put on their table there. And you can see the ones at the bottom right, these are the Pranjpes in Bundelkhand, and their whole food for 1 week is there. And you can see, when we talk about efficiency, we're going to be talking about very different things. The efficiency is one part of it. And as the Admiral said, very, very perceptively, there's the whole question of sufficiency too. Now, sufficiency comes in two forms. Sufficiency is sufficiency from greed, that's the upper limit, to lower the ceiling, if you like, and sufficiency for the poor is raising the floor. It's the lower limit. So we must understand the differences that the rich, the people suffering from this disease called affluenza, are going to have to converge in some way with the poor who suffer from povertitis, who don't have enough to have a decent life, have to be raised. This girl is asking, what can I do for my country, and what has my country done for me? And I think our story, I'm having a little trouble with my clicker, is about the decisions we make. Now, the decisions I'm going to talk about are decisions that lock us in for decades and centuries. The kinds of decisions that the Club of Rome India is now looking at are things that we've got to decide, which is so profound, so big, that they will either preordain the kind of future we have for many, many decades, and these are really what we're talking about: resources of very many different kinds. Material resources, as you can see from these bar charts, are being consumed more and more. And in China and India, we're not doing too badly. We're using lots and lots. Now, the interesting part about resource metabolism is that it really does grow with income. There's no Kuznets curve here. There's no turnaround. You go from Ghana to China to India all the way up, and it just keeps on growing. It just keeps on growing. The countries below the trend line are slightly more efficient. They use less resources for extra GDP. The ones above it are less efficient, but by and large, they're all keeping on growing. And the issue now is, how do we turn them around? How do we decouple economic growth, prosperity, well-being from resource use? That is the fundamental question, and that applies to everyone. It applies to the North, it applies to the South, and the question with the South is, can we tunnel through? Do we have ways to avoid going all the way through the hill, the top, wasting resources, and then coming down because you can afford to do that? Ultimately, we all, the rich and the poor, are going to have to converge, and our latest calculations are that if you have consumption around the world, which is per capita more than 6 tons, you're going to be in very serious trouble with ecological breakdowns, with massive disruptions of the ecosystem. So we basically have a look. For the last 10 years, I've been chairman of the International Resource Panel, and many of the things that we detected and learned over there are really quite frightening. Here, you can't tell because of the smallness of the print, but India is way down here, if you can see it, and the rest of the countries in Europe way up there in the use of different kinds of metals. And if India wants to live like Northern Europe or America, it's going to climb that ladder. However, we do have one advantage. We are latecomers, and latecomers have the ability to use the latest technologies. So for some good reasons, the Indian industrial productivity, and therefore efficiency, has been actually climbing faster than the world average, simply because we're introducing new technologies in our industries, and therefore we do have an advantage over there. The issues that concern people who are worried about resources is, of course, peaking of food production, peaking of topsoil, peaking of phosphorus, collapse of fisheries, water supplies, rare earths, uranium. These are all things that are finite. It's not that the Earth doesn't have a lot of them. Of course, the Earth is almost infinite amount of every one of these things. But economically, to extract them for human use becomes more and more expensive. And therefore, they are called peaks. And here is the important diagram. This shows what we call decoupling. The top line, the blue one, is GDP growth. And if you can lower your environmental use below that, that is called relative decoupling. And if you can reduce the resource use Absolutely, that's called absolute decoupling. And we believe in the Club of Rome, India, that the North should be aiming for absolute decoupling. They should be actually reducing their use of resources every year. And the developing countries, like India, need to reduce the amount they use each year relative to the GDP. Now, the pathways to decoupling come both from consumption patterns, lifestyles, products, services, and from production systems, the kinds of technologies and products we use. Pathways to decoupling are very complex. This is a causal loop diagram of our material society, a very simplified one, but it shows that what you do needs very careful thinking. What is interesting from the findings of the International Resource Panel is that there is a great deal of stuff that we can reuse, recycle, remanufacture much more cheaply than digging it out of the ground and starting again. As I said, urban mining is a very important feature for India's future. The ecological footprint, which you all understand, has been growing inexorably. At independence, India was using 1/3 of the bioproductivity of the land, and today it's using 70% more than it produces. Therefore, we are actually bringing down the bank balance that Mother Nature gave us at an incredible rate, and we are basically using up all the bounties of nature that we have. And this actually is a as the Admiral pointed out, that we have a lot of other issues that we talk about, but resources are a geopolitical issue, probably the biggest. You know, the whole history of mankind is about expanding into places looking for resources. In fact, the whole history of colonialism is nothing else but looking for other people's resources. And your footprint then becomes a boot print. It becomes a boot print, whether it's your own local billionaires in your own country or the billionaires overseas, they want your resources. And that's why the tribals and the forest people and everybody else has to pay the costs of all that. So I'm sorry, my clicker is giving me a little bit of a problem. Where do I point it? Okay, very quickly, it is possible to live today easily with technologies available, with our own lifestyles, with 5 times less use of resources. And there are millions of examples of lighting, of LEDs, of structures, of solar and wind energy. Here's a very interesting example. We were talking about cities, and Ranjit and others talked about the issue of designing cities, as Kirit did earlier on. Here is 2 stark examples. The city on the left is Atlanta, and the city on the right is Barcelona. Now, both of them have about 2.5 million people. One is only livable with at least 2 cars or 3 cars in a family, and the other one is a pure bicycling city. And it's a very, very different lifestyle. And anybody who's been to Atlanta and to Barcelona will tell you that Barcelona is 10 times more livable than Atlanta. And this is what it looks like. It's a completely different setup. Bicycles available for rent wherever you go, connected to the satellite. This is Copenhagen. So it's not, I mean, this is one of the richest countries in the world, Denmark. And everybody, there are more cycles in Denmark than there are people. So it's a complicated issue. Now, to do decoupling, and I'd like to really finish so that I can give my colleagues a chance to speak, is all about looking at the unserved. How do we get our country people to get good living standards and be able to do this? I show you this picture just as an example. This is the headquarters of my own organization in South Delhi, and it's made almost entirely out of recycled materials. It uses fly ash from power stations, it uses stone dust from mining areas, it uses construction and demolition waste. Only 40% of that building is virgin material. And if you look at the energy costs, the embodied energy is about 60% less than normal buildings, and the operational energy that we use is about 55 or 60% less. So it is possible to have a very elegant, very functional building with totally different outcomes from an ecological point of view. And the reason that we reduce our energy content is because we learned from nature. That's a termite hill, and in the termite hill, the queen termite has to be protected at 24.6 degrees, plus or minus 1. And they figured out a way of making conduits in there which increase the airflow in such a way that whatever the temperature is outside, it's always 24.6 degrees inside. And that is how you design buildings, not to need air conditioners. So I'm going to finish there, basically by saying that we have all kinds of new approaches that only our scientists in India can think about. They may be applicable elsewhere. They certainly will be applicable in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia. They may even be applicable in Europe and North America, but they're not going to be discovered other than by people here. And that's why the Club of Rome India is so important.